My grandpa was lying face down on our front lawn, blood on his cheek, gravel in his hair, and a pistol aimed between his shoulder blades. The trembling hands holding it, HOA President Karen Lancaster's. She was screaming something about trespassing, about HOA authority, about how this old man didn't follow community protocol. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined, was that this old man used to lead joint task force extractions in Kabul, and I, the man sprinting down the porch steps, was a sitting federal judge. And this little stunt? This was going to cost her everything. What happens when a power-drunk HOA president crosses a line not even the law can forgive? Oak Glen Estates looked like the kind of place that promised peace. Tree-lined streets, neat lawns, white fences spaced perfectly apart like uniformed soldiers. It had curb appeal, that polished veneer of upper-middle-class comfort. And I'll admit, after years buried in the chaos of courtrooms and federal briefings, that illusion was exactly what I thought my grandfather needed. He was recovering from a second stroke, minor, thank God, but enough to warrant a relocation from our old two-story home to something quieter, easier to manage. I took a post in a nearby judicial circuit, trimmed my caseload, and moved us into a single-level house near the edge of the development. I'd chosen Oak Glen for one reason only: stability. What I got was a petty tyrant in pastel and pearls who treated our property line like it was a military front and our mailbox like a declaration of war. Her name was Karen Lancaster, and if there was one thing she couldn't tolerate, it was a man she couldn't intimidate, and that man, unfortunately for her, was my grandfather. The first week, she dropped off a welcome packet with a smile so tight it looked surgically stapled to her cheeks. "We pride ourselves on harmony here," she said, placing a thick white envelope on our porch table. Her eyes flicked to the Marine Corps flag my grandfather had hung next to the American one. "Though we do encourage a neutral aesthetic when it comes to militaristic signage." She said it like it left a bad taste in her mouth. My grandfather, who had overheard her from the garden, just looked up from his shovel, wiped sweat from his brow, and muttered, "I didn't lose 2 friends at Hugh City to be told my country's flag needs to match someone's curtains." Karen didn't laugh. She didn't even twitch, just clutched her clipboard tighter and gave a sharp nod. "I'll note the concern," she said, already scribbling something before she turned away. By the second week, we got our first violation notice, typed, laminated, and zip-tied to our doorknob like it was a parking ticket from God. The infraction? Improper display of unauthorized freestanding decor. The decor in question was a brass eagle statue my grandfather had welded himself 2 decades ago. He'd mounted it on the front lawn between the walkway and the flower bed, proud and polished, wings spread wide like it was guarding the property. According to Karen's Community Guidelines Handbook, Section 4, Subsection 6, no sculpture over 18 inches tall was permitted unless it was approved by the aesthetic board. We didn't even know an aesthetic board existed. When I tried to contest the notice, I was told that all board votes were conducted via a private online portal, and I should have read the digital bylaw amendment addendum sent via email. I checked my inbox. Nothing. Not even in spam. Then came the nonsense about my grandfather's attire. He liked to garden, always had. He'd wake up early, brew a thermos of black coffee, and put on his old utility pants and a faded USMC t-shirt from the 80s. It was routine. Healing. But apparently, according to Karen, it violated the neighborhood's visual coherence expectation. One afternoon, she stopped by while he was weeding near the driveway. I was at work. She stood just behind him on the sidewalk, arms crossed, voice pitched just high enough for the neighbor across the street to hear. "Sir," she said, "we've received complaints about excessive wear and suggestive messaging on clothing. We ask that all residents adhere to community presentation standards while in public view." My grandfather straightened up, turned around, and looked her dead in the eyes. "You telling me a shirt with a Marine Corps logo is suggestive now?" he asked. She blinked but didn't back down. The board has agreed that certain attire might cause discomfort or convey aggressive themes. Grandpa didn't yell, didn't even raise his voice. Just turned and walked back into the house, dirty gloves in one hand, the other shaking slightly, not from fear, but fury he was trying to contain. I tried to talk to Karen directly after that. I requested a sit-down. She refused. Said all HOA communications had to go through the Community Resolutions Form, a 13-page PDF that required 2 neighbor endorsements and a notarized signature. I'm not exaggerating. This wasn't just micromanagement. It was a bureaucratic fortress. Still, I persisted. I showed up at the monthly HOA meeting, tie loosened, folders in hand, prepared to address the new wave of complaints we were suddenly facing. Karen barely let me speak. She controlled the gavel like a courtroom tyrant and cut me off with the phrase, "Your time is up," before I could finish my second sentence. The rest of the board, 5 retirees with blank stares and glazed expressions, nodded along like a choir of bobbleheads. It was clear from the start. She didn't just run the HOA. She was the HOA. It was small things, at first. A citation for our trash cans being visible from the street, never mind that every house on our block had theirs in the same spot. A warning about our porch light being too bright after 9 p.m., despite it being a standard motion-activated security light. Then the sprinkler complaint. According to the HOA, our automatic sprinklers sprayed beyond our designated lawn boundary, which somehow counted as water theft from the communal landscaping budget. I had to read that one 3 times. And every time I asked for documentation, Karen responded with, "It's not about punishment, it's about maintaining our standards." My grandfather didn't help, bless him. He refused to back down, started mowing the lawn in his old army boots just to piss her off. He rigged an extra spotlight above the eagle statue and angled it skyward like a miniature bat signal. One night, I came home from work to find him in the garage with welding goggles on, bolting an American flag bracket to our mailbox post. "If I'm going to get fined," he said, "might as well earn it." I tried to rein him in, begged him to lay low until I could handle things through the courts, but he just laughed and handed me a beer. "Son," he said, "I've been shot at in 3 countries. You think I'm scared of a woman named Karen with a walkie-talkie and a copier?" Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. This wasn't just about rule enforcement. It was targeted. My neighbors told me in hushed tones that they'd never seen Karen this relentless. "She's always been strict," one said. "But she's gunning for you two," another neighbor whispered. "She doesn't like people who don't bend. That statue? That's not an eagle to her. That's a middle finger." The paranoia wasn't just mine. We started finding strange footprints around our backyard gate, boot prints that didn't match ours. Our ring cam picked up someone loitering near the side fence at 2 a.m., but the footage was too blurry to ID. Our mailbox started getting stuffed with HOA flyers we hadn't requested, some of them folded around anonymous complaint letters. One even included a hand-drawn map of our lawn with circled violations in red marker. I was used to dealing with manipulation. I'd seen worse from white-collar defendants in courtrooms across the country. But this was different. Karen wasn't after money. She wanted submission, control. My grandfather, who walked with a cane and bore a shrapnel scar across his back, had become a symbol of defiance in her perfectly curated kingdom. And I was guilty by association. She couldn't control us through rules, so she started inventing them. I found an addendum to the HOA handbook slipped under our door one night. It was dated that morning but referenced a violation I hadn't even committed yet. Unauthorized signage attached to private fencing. I hadn't installed any signs. Yet. That was the moment I realized. She wasn't reacting to infractions. She was setting traps. By the end of our first month in Oak Glen, my grandfather had racked up over 1,400 in HOA fines. All for things like flag placement, excessive wind chimes, and non-uniform mulch. And when I appealed, the HOA response was a form letter. "Your concerns have been noted. Compliance remains expected." But it wasn't just about fees. Karen had started walking by our house more often, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. She always had her phone out. Sometimes she took photos. Sometimes she just stared. My grandfather started keeping a journal, every visit, every interaction. "This isn't about a statue," he wrote on the last page I read. "It's about fear. And some people only feel powerful when they make others feel small." He was right. I knew then that she wasn't going to stop. Not with warnings, not with fines, not with veiled threats wrapped in laminated letters. She wanted a fight. She wanted one of us to snap. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what she was waiting for. It didn't take long for Karen to escalate from laminated warnings and passive-aggressive bylaws to something that felt a lot more like surveillance. At first, it was subtle. We'd see the same rust-colored golf cart parked at the end of the block, idling just long enough to make us wonder if it was coincidental. But then it started appearing at exact times, when my grandfather took his morning walk, when I left for work, when our landscaper showed up for the monthly trim. Eventually, we caught sight of who was inside, a man in his mid-20s, cargo pants, black aviators, always scribbling into a notebook like he was tailing a criminal. My grandfather, who spent 3 tours avoiding actual recon teams in jungles and deserts, didn't need more than a glance to figure out what was happening. "That's not a neighbor," he said. "That's a scout." The guy's name was Caleb, Karen's nephew, apparently. A failed security guard trainee with a fragile ego and a surplus of mall cop energy. Word was, he'd flunked out of a local community watch program after trying to detain a jogger for suspicious hydration. Now he was Karen's personal enforcer, the single-member HOA safety patrol she invented at the last board meeting. No vote, no oversight. Just a name badge she laminated herself and pinned to his tactical vest. Caleb took his job seriously. Too seriously. He started walking our street with a GoPro strapped to his chest and a clipboard labeled Field Citations. Every time my grandfather stepped off our property line, even if it was to toss a weed into the storm drain, Caleb would mark something down. "Public nuisance," he once muttered loud enough for me to hear. "Violation. Loitering on communal path." My grandfather wasn't a man who rattled easy, but I started seeing it wear on him. He shortened his walks, stopped carrying his gardening shears in public, started checking the locks twice at night. The man who once cleared explosives in a war zone was now pacing our living room like a caged animal, muttering, "They're up to something." I didn't disagree. Then came the drone. It was a bright orange quadcopter with flashing blue lights and a camera mounted underneath. I noticed it first while grilling one afternoon. It buzzed in low, hovered near the patio for a moment, then darted upward and zipped away. I assumed it was a neighbor's kid. But the next morning, while my grandfather was tending the rose bushes near the sidewalk, the drone reappeared. This time it dipped down low, way too low. The whirring of the propeller startled him, and when he turned to swat it away, he lost his footing and went down hard. I heard the thump from inside the house. Ran out to find him flat on his side, clutching his wrist and trying not to swear. The drone, gone. But not before I caught a final glimpse of it soaring back toward the HOA clubhouse, where Karen's SUV just happened to be parked. I confronted her that same afternoon, knocked on her office door and asked, calmly at first, if she knew anything about an orange drone buzzing our property. She didn't deny it, didn't even blink. Just smiled and said, "We've begun implementing aerial monitoring as part of our new community safety protocol. It's perfectly legal. We're gathering data on hazardous landscaping patterns." Hazardous. That was the word she used to describe my 78-year-old grandfather kneeling near a rosebush. I stared at her, trying to find some crack in the porcelain. Nothing. She genuinely believed she had the right to monitor our every move. If your grandfather didn't behave so unpredictably, she added, he wouldn't draw so much attention. My blood went cold. That wasn't oversight. That was targeted harassment, and she knew it. Worse, she reveled in it. That night, Grandpa and I went to work. We installed a concealed GoPro in the porch lantern and 2 motion-activated trail cameras by the gate and back fence. Not because we wanted to catch Karen doing anything illegal, though we figured she might, but because we needed proof. Real hard footage. I'd dealt with bureaucratic stone walls before. The only way to tear them down was with evidence sharp enough to pierce their precious protocol. It didn't take long. Within 3 days, we had footage of Caleb reaching over our fence and adjusting the irrigation timer. Another clip showed him opening our mailbox, snapping a photo, and then walking away. We cross-checked the timestamps with the HOA notices we received later that week. It lined up. He was tampering with our property, then using the information to fabricate violations. The final nail was a blurry clip of Karen herself, standing just off the sidewalk near our hydrangeas, phone in hand, narrating to someone on the other end. We might need to declare that section as common buffer space. It'll give us more leverage. I filed a report with the county, cited interference with mail delivery, tampering with utilities, trespassing, but nothing came of it. The sheriff's office referred me to the HOA's Internal Conflict Resolution Board, which she chaired. When I demanded a third-party review, she sent us a letter that made my blood boil. Any further escalation of complaints will be considered harassment, it read. Please cease this pattern of retaliatory behavior. Your property is under review for potential compliance escalation. The next day, Caleb posted a bright red notice on our mailbox. Warning: community disruption under investigation, in bold black letters. Like we were a public health hazard. And just when I thought the absurdity couldn't climb higher, Karen made her next move. A cease and desist letter arrived, certified mail, wrapped in legal-looking formatting. The contents? A formal accusation that my grandfather was inciting neighborhood unrest by exhibiting unregulated militaristic behavior. The examples listed were laughable. Wearing camouflage pants while trimming shrubs, saluting a neighbor who appeared confused, and my personal favorite, possession of a decorative helmet visible through garage window. It wasn't satire. It was signed, sealed, and notarized. We urge the Ellis household to discontinue behavior that may cause psychological distress to other residents. My grandfather read it, exhaled through his nose, and then ripped the paper into 4 even pieces. She wants me gone, he said, tossing the shreds in the trash. Not fined, not quieted, gone. He wasn't wrong. The next HOA meeting wasn't advertised in the usual monthly flyer. We only heard about it through our neighbor Susan, who whispered it to me during a grocery run like she was passing state secrets. Karen's holding a private session next week, she said, eyes darting around. Agenda says something about emergency community safety amendments. No public comment. I dug deeper. Found out Karen had started collecting signatures for a formal motion to revoke our HOA membership, a rare procedural move that required board majority and 2/3 neighbor consensus. The reason? Persistent noncompliance and community disharmony. It was unprecedented, but technically allowed. Meanwhile, the harassment kept escalating. Caleb began circling the block with a body cam, narrating everything Grandpa did like he was filming an episode of Cops. Subject is applying unauthorized fertilizer. Subject is engaged in unknown mechanical activity. It was a sprinkler head repair. The man once tasked with tactical coordination in enemy territory was now being trailed by a clipboard clutching rent-a-cop in pastel cargo shorts. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so vile. My grandfather didn't say much during those weeks. He kept to himself, cooked dinner in silence, sometimes just stood on the porch staring at the flag, like he was trying to remember which version of America he'd fought for. The version where citizens were protected, or the one where petty tyrants built kingdoms out of bylaws and fear. I tried everything I could think of. Filed a second complaint. Presented the footage to the HOA's third-party mediator, who, surprise, turned out to be Karen's old college roommate. When that didn't work, I submitted a grievance to the county's Housing Oversight Committee. The earliest appointment? 6 weeks away. We didn't have 6 weeks. The petition to have us removed from the HOA was circulating faster than I could keep up with, and the neighbors? Most stayed silent, not because they agreed, but because they were afraid. Karen had fined people for letting their toddlers chalk on sidewalks. She'd issued citations for unapproved wind chimes. She had a reputation. Now she had a target. That's when Grandpa said the words that snapped something in me. He stood in the kitchen holding a mug of lukewarm coffee, staring at a new letter we'd received. This one claiming he'd intimidated a community garden volunteer by looking at her sternly. He didn't get angry. Didn't raise his voice. He just looked at me and said, "You know, I've seen a lot of battles, but I never thought my last one would be in a suburb." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Because I knew right then, this wasn't about flags, or lawn statues, or camouflage shirts. It was about power, abuse, And the moment Karen weaponized fear against a man who had risked everything for freedom, she crossed the line from annoying into dangerous. So I did what any good judge would do. I gathered evidence, I drafted motions, I started building a case. Because if Karen wanted war, I was going to give her one, legally, tactically, and with enough force to make sure she never pointed her weaponized HOA at another family again. The next chapter wasn't about violations. It was about justice. And Karen Lancaster had no idea who she'd just declared war on. It happened on a Tuesday morning. That detail sticks with me. How something so grotesquely unjust could unfold under the indifferent light of a weekday sun, with birds chirping, sprinklers hissing down the street, and garbage trucks humming like it was just another slow morning in suburbia. I was in chambers early that day, reviewing a case file on a pharmaceutical fraud trial I was presiding over. The irony would catch up with me later. I'd just poured my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. 6 missed calls from my neighbor, Susan, followed by one text that drained every ounce of blood from my face. "Come home now. Karen pulled a gun on your grandpa." My coffee hit the desk. I was out the door in seconds. The drive blurred. My thoughts didn't. Only one thing repeated in my skull, louder than my pulse. Not him. Not here. Not again. By the time I pulled up to the house, 3 squad cars were already parked crooked along the curb, red and blue lights spinning lazily, like sirens were just a suggestion. Our neighbors gathered in a loose semicircle down the street, some in bathrobes, some in lawn chairs, all with expressions of disbelief and horror. And in the middle of it, like the twisted star of some HOA nightmare circus, stood Karen Lancaster. Arms crossed, mouth pursed into that familiar scowl of hers, lips moving like she was giving a press conference. And next to her, face down on the grass, was my grandfather. His left hand still clutched the pruning shears he'd been using. Blood smeared across one cheekbone, a torn flannel sleeve, a scrape on the temple. 2 officers were helping him sit up, but not one of them looked particularly rushed to do it. And in Karen's hand, dangling like it was a purse instead of a deadly weapon, was a black pistol, not holstered, not secured, still out, still hot, still aimed toward the man she had just knocked to the ground. I parked the car halfway in the street, sprinted up the walkway, and got as far as, what the hell, before Officer Mason, a square-jawed lump of county arrogance I'd seen in court once or twice, stepped in my way with a hand on his belt. "Sir, we're handling the situation," he said, tone clipped, rehearsed. "We're advising everyone to remain calm." I wasn't calm. My voice wasn't calm. My eyes definitely weren't calm. "She pulled a weapon on an elderly man," I snapped. "She drew on my grandfather." He nodded slowly, as if he'd heard the words but filed them under civil disagreement. "There was a disturbance," he replied. "We're sorting through conflicting accounts. HOA President Lancaster claims your grandfather approached her in an aggressive manner, ignored a verbal trespass warning, and made a sudden motion with what she perceived to be a weapon. The pruning shears." He meant the gardening tool. My blood boiled in real time. "That's not a weapon. That's a tool." His eyes narrowed. "Perception matters, especially in community disputes. Emotions run high." It was a script. I realized that mid-sentence. He wasn't investigating. He was smoothing, de-escalating, treating this like a squabble between kids who couldn't share sidewalk chalk. "Where's the weapon now?" I asked. "Did you disarm her?" He tilted his head toward a deputy behind him who held an evidence bag, still unsealed. Karen stood off to the side, arms folded, speaking calmly to another officer who nodded along with the occasional sympathetic grunt. My grandfather sat silently on the curb now, hands in his lap, blood drying on his cheek. And then I saw it, what changed everything. Susan, my neighbor. Mid-50s, retired schoolteacher, never raised her voice in the years I'd known her. She stood about 20 feet from the sidewalk, holding up her iPhone, face pale but steady. She caught my eye and nodded once. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it hit me like thunder. "I recorded everything." I motioned for her. She walked up beside me, unlocked her phone, and played the clip. The quality was grainy. The sound, crystal clear. Karen's voice echoed across the speaker. "This is a citizen's arrest. You're trespassing. Step back, or I will defend my property." The video showed my grandfather stepping backward, clearly confused, lifting his hands, but Karen advanced, gun drawn, posture aggressive, shouting something about non-compliant behavior. Then, suddenly, she shoved him. He stumbled, tripped on the edge of the sidewalk, hit the ground. The gun lowered until it was aimed square at his chest. In the background, Caleb's voice chirped, "Get on the ground, old man, or she'll shoot." And then silence. I handed the phone to Officer Mason. He watched it. I could see the shift in his jawline, the twitch in his cheek. But when the clip ended, all he said was, "We'll include this in the incident report. No cuffs, no orders, no arrest." Karen hadn't even been questioned under Miranda. She was still standing there like she had just thwarted a home invasion, not assaulted a disabled veteran on his own front lawn. I stepped forward again, voice sharp now, precise, every syllable honed by a decade on the federal bench. "You have probable cause. You have evidence of assault, a drawn firearm, a civilian on the ground, witnesses, video documentation. And still you're telling me this is just a neighborhood disagreement?" Mason didn't blink. "Sir, we've been advised this is an ongoing civil matter between homeowners. HOA related, not criminal." That word hit like a sledgehammer. Not criminal. As if laws didn't apply on trimmed lawns and cul-de-sacs with picket fences. As if Karen's HOA status made her bulletproof. As if my grandfather's blood on the curb was just another inconvenience, like overgrown grass or an off-color mailbox. I looked over at Karen. She was smiling now. Not wide. Just a faint, smug curl at the corner of her lips. The look of someone who knew the game, who'd stacked the board, who'd already paid off the referee. And for the first time since we moved into Oak Glen, I realized how far she was willing to go. This wasn't about violations anymore, or flags, or lawn statues. This was about domination, control. She had learned she could push us, fine us, shame us, follow us. And now, finally, she learned she could lay her hands and her gun on us and get away with it. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was who she just threatened. Not the man on the ground, me, the man standing in front of her. The man who'd put federal prosecutors behind bars for lesser offenses. The man who'd ruled over criminal trials involving organized racketeering, illegal surveillance, and civil rights violations. She thought she'd won. That the silence of the badge wearers around her meant safety. That the weapon in her hand made her untouchable. She thought the neighborhood was hers. The streets. The rules. The people. She had no idea she'd just committed her last mistake. Because in that moment, under that slow-turning sky, with my grandfather bleeding and my neighbor's video burning a hole in my back pocket, something inside me snapped, not like glass, but like a blade unsheathing. I helped my grandfather inside while the officers collected statements. Karen waved goodbye to them like they were party guests. Not a single officer walked over to us. No one asked if he needed medical attention. Not one apology, just a polite reminder to de-escalate tensions and pursue appropriate channels, as if we hadn't already, as if any of them had worked. Inside, I cleaned the wound on Grandpa's temple while he sat silent, breathing through clenched teeth. I asked him what she said before she drew the gun. He looked at me and said, "She called me a squatter, said people like me were ruining her neighborhood. People like me." He didn't have to say it twice. I knew what she meant. Veterans. Fighters. People who'd actually bled for a flag she only waved when it fit her aesthetic. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my study and watched the video over and over, cataloging every detail. The angle of her approach, the timing of the weapon draw, the tone of her voice. I transcribed it, timestamped it, created a packet. I printed frames and analyzed posture. I created a chain of custody log. I ran a digital forensics check on the video file metadata. By sunrise, I had a court-ready evidence folder more complete than anything those cops had even bothered to compile. Not because I was planning to sue, not yet, but because I was done playing defense. This wasn't going to be another file buried in HOA records. This was going to be a reckoning. And Karen Lancaster, gun-toting, rule-fabricating, tyrant in pastels, was going to learn exactly what it meant to pick a fight with a federal judge. She pulled a gun on my grandfather, and the system protected her. That was her final advantage, and now it was mine. The silence that followed the gun incident was louder than any siren. No arrests, no charges, not even a follow-up call. But what Karen didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly comprehend, was that silence, to me, was not a dead end. It was oxygen. Because while she celebrated her little victory, threw smug glances at passing neighbors, and continued her suburban dominion like nothing had happened, I was already setting the stage for her fall. Not a reaction, a strategy, not anger, precision. The law is a slow knife when wielded correctly, and I planned to carve out every inch of rot she'd embedded into this community. The morning after, I pulled every file I had: complaint letters, violation notices, HOA emails, committee vote summaries, financial disclosures, every petty ticket she ever sent us. I opened a folder on my desktop and named it Operation Lancaster. Then I started building the legal version of a tripwire. My first move was subtle. I contacted every neighbor I could think of who'd ever whispered discontent about Karen's reign. People who'd once grumbled behind closed doors but never dared speak up. I didn't approach them as a judge. I didn't even bring up the gun. I came as a neighbor, as a son, as a man whose elderly grandfather had just been thrown to the ground by someone who thought power made her bulletproof. It worked. Slowly, one by one, they opened up. The woman at the end of the block whose mailbox was mysteriously damaged after voting against Karen's new paint policy. The family that had been fined for a backyard playset that exceeded decibel limits but had no official complaint on file. The single mother who said her HOA dues doubled after she refused to let Karen's nephew inspect her perimeter without a warrant. I took notes, recorded interviews, compiled them like legal ammunition. But allegations weren't enough. I needed paper. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act request to the county office for all HOA financial filings from the last 3 years. It didn't take long to find the first crack. Landscaping expenditures showed $12,400 paid to Evergreen Solutions LLC for community greenery refresh projects. Problem was, that company didn't exist, at least not in any business registry. Dig a little deeper, and you'd find the address listed was a P.O. box in another county. And the listed contact? A C. Lancaster. Caleb, Karen's nephew. That was the first crime. Embezzlement masquerading as community beautification. The second was even worse. Falsified minutes from the HOA meeting that allegedly authorized those funds. I had attended that meeting. I remembered every smug motion Karen made from that podium. There had never been a landscaping vote, but the minutes, conveniently uploaded a week later, claimed unanimous approval, my name included. I pulled bank records, cross-referenced vendor payments, found 2 other shell entities tied to other HOA board members, a fake security consultant service that billed the HOA $500 a month for evening surveillance, and a property signage supplier that had supposedly replaced all community entry signs, except the signs were the same ones that had been there since 2003. The kicker? All the invoices were approved by Karen herself. I could already see the headlines: HOA Queen Pins, Suburb into Embezzlement Ring. But I wasn't finished. I wanted more than exposure. I wanted leverage. That's when I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a former clerk of mine, now a U.S. Marshal, who owed me a favor. I gave him everything. I told him I wasn't asking for intervention. I was asking for observation, just eyes on the ground. If Karen slipped, I wanted someone watching who didn't answer to her county buddies. He agreed, quietly, and assigned a field agent in plain clothes to attend the next HOA meeting. While that was brewing, I contacted a journalist, Maya Singh, an investigative reporter I'd worked with during a federal corruption case in D.C. Smart. Sharp, relentless. I told her everything. Sent redacted files, proof of false minutes, financial trail, footage of the firearm incident. She didn't even pause. "I've been looking into suburban power structures for months," she said. "But this is something else. This is a syndicate with hydrangeas." We arranged a discreet meeting at a coffee shop 2 towns over. I gave her hard copies, backups, a burner email. She promised confidentiality until I gave the word to publish. I planned to give it after Karen fell into the trap I was laying. But first, I needed to deal with the judicial shield that had been protecting her. See, the reason Karen got away with so much wasn't just fear. It was her connection to the local magistrate, Judge Russell Gaffney, a man who looked like a Norman Rockwell painting and ruled like a Tammany Hall crony. He signed off on every HOA charter amendment without review, dismissed civil complaints from homeowners without hearings, even overruled injunctions against HOA actions filed by residents in small claims court. It was a closed loop. HOA enforces. Karen escalates. Gaffney protects. I filed a formal complaint with the State Judicial Conduct Board. Not anonymously, not quietly. I filed it under my full name, full title, and with 143 pages of exhibits. It wasn't a request for review. It was a declaration of war. And then, as if on cue, Karen made her final mistake. She filed a civil lawsuit against me. The official charge? Sustained harassment, slander of leadership, and attempted destabilization of a lawful neighborhood governance body. I almost laughed when I received the envelope. It was thick, decorated in faux legalese. Filed by a firm known more for personal injury billboard ads than constitutional nuance. But buried deep within the complaint was a golden gift, an affidavit signed by Karen herself, swearing that she had never drawn a weapon on any community resident and never physically engaged with the defendant's family member in any hostile or intimidating manner. It was a lie. A documented, time-stamped evidentiary lie submitted to federal court. Perjury, fraud upon the court. Game over. What Karen didn't know, what her carnival lawyer didn't even think to check, was that I'd quietly filed a removal motion 2 days before, citing the federal implications of HOA misuse of funds and coordinated fraud across state-chartered entities. The moment she submitted that false affidavit, she handed me the loaded gun of jurisdiction. Because now, this wasn't a neighborhood spat, it was a federal matter, and I was in the exact position I needed to be. Not just as the defendant, but as the man who understood every inch of the courtroom she'd just stepped into. Karen Lancaster had entered my world with her paperwork forged and her lies notarized. And in doing so, she'd triggered the legal equivalent of a snare trap, one that would snap shut in front of the press, the public, and every trembling neighbor she'd bullied into silence. The best part? She had no idea. She thought she was cornering me, that the lawsuit would shut me up, that I'd pay her off or move out or beg for leniency. But while she threw herself a victory brunch and posed in front of her azaleas with Caleb posting Facebook rants about saving the HOA from internal threats, I was finalizing subpoenas, drafting interrogatories, preparing witness lists. I wasn't defending myself. I was prosecuting her. Every step she took now was preordained. Every lie she told added to the firewood. Every smug declaration she gave to the neighborhood email list about preserving Oak Glen values was going into my motion for summary judgment. Karen thought she was building a case, but she wasn't. She was digging a grave. And when she climbed in, smiled for the camera, and held up that fraudulent affidavit like it was a sword, she gave me the final piece, proof of intent, willful deception. And all of it, in her handwriting, under oath, in a jurisdiction she thought she controlled. I didn't file a counterclaim. Not yet. I let the silence grow. I let her bask. Because the next step wasn't going to be quiet. It was going to be federal. And when it landed, it wouldn't just be Karen's fall. It would be the detonation that collapsed the entire HOA model she'd built like a suburban house of cards. She brought a pistol to a legal war, and she aimed it at a judge's family. Now it was time to show her what happens when the judge fires back. The courthouse was silent when she walked in, heels clicking against the polished tile like a metronome of arrogance. Karen Lancaster, self-appointed queen of Oak Glen Estates, flanked by her lawyer, some B-grade civil litigator named Donnie Tulls, who looked like he belonged behind a used car desk, not in a federal courtroom. She had no idea what was about to happen, not a clue. She stood tall, wearing a seafoam green power suit that matched the artificial warmth of her campaign headshots, waving politely to the few neighbors she recognized in the gallery. Like this was a ribbon-cutting ceremony, and not the end of her delusional empire. She glanced at me once as she entered, that familiar Karen smirk spreading across her face, as if to say, "This is my courtroom now." It was almost beautiful, the confidence, the blissful ignorance. Like watching a person walk into a burning building while humming a lullaby. The bailiff called us to rise. Court was now in session. Her lawsuit, filed with much fanfare and little merit, had kicked open the door to federal jurisdiction the moment she committed perjury in a signed affidavit. My motion to consolidate multiple related claims, civil fraud, misuse of funds, HOA corruption, and civil rights violations, had been granted by Judge Carter, a colleague and old friend of mine from the 11th Circuit. We'd made arrangements behind the scenes. I wouldn't preside, but I would prosecute, pro se, as the injured party. The irony? Delicious. Karen had tried to silence a judge with a fabricated complaint. Now she was about to face one with the power to rip her entire regime apart, piece by fraudulent piece. The courtroom filled slowly with HOA residents, reporters, and a quiet swarm of federal agents and auditors. My U.S. Marshal contact sat near the back, arms crossed, eyes sharp, ready to deliver the hammer. And in the front row, Susan, the neighbor whose phone had captured the assault, sat with a printed transcript of her video, resting in her lap like a holy text. My grandfather wasn't in the courtroom. Not yet. He wanted to walk in only after she perjured herself under oath. His call. He earned that right. We began with her side. Her attorney, bless him, opened with the usual song and dance. His client was a dedicated civic leader, a victim of smear tactics, someone who had endured months of psychological torment at the hands of an uncooperative resident bent on destroying community harmony. He called me a litigious hothead. I let him talk. I wanted him comfortable. I wanted Karen comfortable. She sat there nodding along, flipping through her binder like she was preparing a TED Talk on neighborhood beautification. She had no idea the binder she was thumbing through was a tombstone. My turn. I rose slowly, walked to the center of the courtroom. My voice was calm, steady, not a trace of the rage I'd buried over the last 3 months. "Your Honor," I said, "before I begin my response, I'd like to introduce myself properly." I turned toward Karen. "My name is Judge Marcus Elias, United States District Court, Southern Circuit, appointed under Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, and today I am here not as a magistrate, but as a citizen, and the grandson of the man your client threatened with a deadly weapon." The air left the room like someone had cracked a window at 30 feet. Karen's lawyer paled. Karen blinked once, twice, her mouth opening without sound like a fish yanked from water. The gallery gasped. The judge's gavel tapped once. "Proceed," she said. What followed wasn't a rebuttal, it was an autopsy. I submitted the drone footage first, over 6 separate videos of Caleb, Karen's nephew, operating unregistered surveillance equipment over private property. Then came the mailbox tampering footage, the irrigation system sabotage, photos, screenshots, date stamped, witness backed. Then I dropped the drone registration violation. It hadn't just been illegal under county ordinance, it was a federal offense due to the drone's proximity to a public school 2 blocks away. I could see Donnie sweat through his collar, but we weren't done. I moved on to the financials. Exhibit B. Fraudulent HOA expenses routed through fake LLCs controlled by Karen and 2 of her board members. Evergreen Solutions, the landscaping firm that didn't exist. Patriot Security Consultants, the surveillance group that never performed a background check. I submitted sworn statements from HOA treasurers past, showing Karen had forged board meeting minutes to authorize funds that were never discussed, the fraudulent vendor addresses, the bounced checks, the altered invoices, and then the pièce de résistance, The forged affidavit she submitted to this court, claiming she never pulled a firearm on my grandfather. The moment the video played, Susan's shaky footage showing Karen's outstretched arm, the pistol aimed square at my grandfather's chest, the slur about squatters, the threats of citizen's arrest. You could hear the entire gallery inhale and stop breathing. Karen's lawyer dropped his pen. Her face collapsed inward, like a house that just lost its foundation. I paused the footage at the exact frame her finger hovered above the trigger and said, "Your Honor, not only is this an unlawful brandishing of a firearm under state law, it also violates County Ordinance 4211, discharging or presenting a firearm in a community residential zone, and her license to carry expired 6 months prior to this incident." Then I handed over the proof. Furthermore, I added, the HOA she claims to represent was improperly chartered. It never filed Form 147C for IRS nonprofit status, making every dollar collected under its name unlawful. Every fine, every lien, every budget item, illegitimate. I dropped the folder onto the evidence table with the kind of finality that made people flinch. This is not a homeowner conflict. This is racketeering, Your Honor. HOA enforced extortion, assault with a deadly weapon, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Karen's lawyer looked at her, then at the judge, and then back at his own briefcase, like he was trying to decide whether to unzip it or vomit into it. The judge didn't even ask for further arguments. She called a brief recess. Karen sat frozen, whispering furiously into her lawyer's ear, her voice rising with each passing second. "He can't do this. He's a judge. This isn't fair." I heard that part. That was the moment she realized she was playing Monopoly in a courtroom full of chess grandmasters. She looked out at the gallery for help, for sympathy, for anything. No one met her gaze. When court reconvened, the judge's ruling was swift. Karen Lancaster is hereby referred for immediate criminal investigation on charges of falsifying federal court documents, illegal surveillance, assault with a deadly weapon, and financial fraud under federal HOA misappropriation statutes. The court moves to dissolve the Oak Glen HOA, effective immediately, pending audit and formal decharter proceedings. All fines levied under this HOA are to be refunded within 60 days. All board members identified in the corruption affidavit are placed under restraining order from all HOA members pending indictment. The gavel came down. Karen didn't speak. Not when the federal agents approached. Not when the cuffs clicked over her wrists. Not when her lawyer muttered "Jesus Christ" and stepped back as if he'd just touched a live wire. She walked out of the courtroom in silence, arms bound, mouth shut, eyes flickering with the first flickers of reality. Caleb was arrested 2 hours later for impersonating a licensed security agent. The other board members went down in the following weeks. One tried to flee to Arizona and got picked up at a gas station outside Phoenix with 8-0 in gift cards and a suitcase full of printed emails. As for the neighborhood, it didn't fall apart. It blossomed. Freed from Karen's chokehold, people started planting real gardens. Kids played on sidewalks without fear of fines. Flags of all kinds waved from porches, some patriotic, some peace-themed. The new community council, volunteer, transparent, inclusive, held monthly meetings at the park instead of behind locked doors. A vote passed unanimously to rename the main entrance. The new sign read simply, "Oak Glen, a community, not a kingdom." And my grandfather? He sat on the front porch the morning after the ruling, sipping his black coffee from a tin mug with a smirk on his face. The bruises were gone. The spirit wasn't. He watched the wind pass through the yard, the newly replanted flagpole beside him snapping smartly in the breeze. The same eagle statue Karen once tried to ban was now uplit with solar lights, restored, polished, and shining like a monument. "You know," he said without looking over, "I liked her better when she just wrote dumb letters." I chuckled. "She won't be writing much anymore." He took a long sip. Good. The sun rose behind him, painting the porch in golden light. And for the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was peace. Justice doesn't always roar in with a badge and a gun. Sometimes it walks into court with a folder and a witness list. Sometimes it's quiet, surgical, precise. Sometimes it takes a while. But when it lands, When it really lands, it doesn't just end tyranny, it buries it. That's what Karen learned. That's what the HOA learned. That's what happens when you aim a gun at the wrong man's grandfather and don't know that man is a federal judge.